The drive was supposed to be simple, a quiet stretch through rural backroads, just the two of us with nothing but open fields on either side. We'd been making small talk, watching the sky shift from a soft orange to the deepening hues of dusk, expecting to reach our destination well before dark. The car purred along, steady and reliable, until it didn't. One moment everything was normal, and the next, a sputter and a slow shudder brought us to an unexpected stop. I tried to restart it, hoping it was just a minor hiccup, but the engine gave nothing back. We were alone, surrounded by endless rows of corn stretching out on either side. As we stepped out of the car, I checked my phone, watching as it failed to find any signal. No way to call for help. The sky grew darker, casting shadows over the field, and a quiet dread settled over us. The realization crept in that we were on our own. Glancing toward the cornfield, we decided our only choice was to walk. The nearest road had to be somewhere on the other side, and cutting through the field seemed like the quickest way. The tall, dense stalks loomed above us as we stepped in, their leaves rustling faintly as we moved through them. The rows of corn stretched endlessly, each one blurring into the next as we walked, with no clear path or landmark to guide us. The setting sun barely pierced through the tall stalks, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to shift and stretch as we moved. The evening grew colder, the air thick with the earthy scent of the cornfield. Every now and then, we paused to listen, but all we heard was silence, deep, endless silence. The sounds of the outside world seemed to fade away, replaced by the quiet rustle of the leaves. We moved forward, feeling like each step took us further from the road rather than closer. Despite our intentions, the field seemed to stretch endlessly, with no sign of a way out. After what felt like hours, we started to realize we were lost. The once clear path had vanished, replaced by a disorienting maze of identical rows, each one as dense as the last. Every turn looked the same, every stalk blending into the next in the dim light. We tried to keep our direction, following the faint remnants of the sunset, but even that was disappearing, the sky now a deep shade of purple, with stars beginning to appear. Our voices sounded small as we discussed where to go next, the sense of dread building with each moment. The rows felt like walls, pressing in on us, and each step felt heavier, like we were walking in circles. It was as if the field itself was changing, leading us further into its depths, further from the road we'd been aiming for. The air felt thicker, colder, and the silence grew more oppressive. It felt like we were the only people left in the world, lost in a field that seemed to have no end. The first sound came quietly, just a faint rustling, and we dismissed it, chalking it up to the wind or some small animal hiding among the stalks. But as we continued, the rustling grew louder, more defined, almost as if something was moving toward us. We exchanged a glance, unease flickering in our eyes, but neither of us spoke. We quickened our pace, pushing forward, hoping to break free of the field soon. Then the sounds changed, footsteps, heavy and deliberate, coming from somewhere behind us. My heart pounded, and we both froze, listening to the rhythm of the steps, which seemed too purposeful to be just an animal. Fear surged through me, cold and sharp, and we started moving again, faster this time. The footsteps followed, growing louder, closer, like they were closing in. We didn't dare look back, didn't dare make a sound. All we could do was keep moving, hoping that whatever was following us would eventually disappear. We moved faster, pushing through the corn, our breaths coming in quick, shallow gasps as we struggled to stay quiet. The footsteps behind us grew louder, and there was no mistaking it now. Someone, or something, was following us. The rows of corn became a blur as we stumbled through them, the sharp leaves scratching at our skin, our only thought to put as much distance as possible between us and the sounds. The footsteps seemed to match our pace, almost taunting us. Every time we thought we'd lost it, the sound would start again, closer than before. My mind raced with possibilities. Who or what could be out here in the darkness, following us through the field? I wanted to look back, to see if there was anything there, but fear held me back. All I could do was run, feeling the weight of the unknown pressing down on us, pushing us deeper into the maze. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. We slowed to a halt, catching our breaths as the silence enveloped us, thick and unnerving. I strained my ears, listening for any sign of movement, but there was nothing, No rustling, no footsteps, just an oppressive quiet that felt even more threatening. We exchanged a look, the fear evident in our eyes, but neither of us dared speak. Every muscle in my body was tense, ready to bolt at the first hint of sound. The silence dragged on, stretching each second into an eternity. I tried to convince myself that whatever had been following us was gone, but the unease lingered, an invisible weight pressing down on us. Then, just as I felt a glimmer of relief, the footsteps started again, this time louder and much closer, as if someone or something was standing right behind us. Out of the darkness, a figure appeared, emerging from the rows of corn like a shadow come to life. He held a shotgun, the barrel pointed down, and his face was obscured in the dim light. We froze, fear and confusion mingling as we tried to process what we were seeing. Then the man spoke, his voice rough but surprisingly calm, and introduced himself as the owner of the field. He explained that he had seen our car lights from his house and had come to investigate after hearing the strange sounds in the field. Relief washed over us, but there was still a lingering fear in his voice, a wariness as he glanced around. He mentioned that animals sometimes wandered into his fields at night, especially predators drawn to the open land. Their movements often created strange noises, he said, scaring away anyone who happened to be nearby. He offered to guide us back to his house, and we followed him, feeling an overwhelming sense of gratitude to have someone leading us out of the maze. The walk back was brief, the rows of corn parting around us as we followed the farmer's steady footsteps. Each step felt like we were leaving the fear and uncertainty behind, the dark field gradually giving way to the light coming from his house. Once inside, we felt a wave of relief, the warmth and light a stark contrast to the cold, oppressive darkness of the field. He offered us a place to sit, and we were finally able to catch our breath, the adrenaline slowly fading. The farmer helped us contact roadside assistance, and as we waited, we shared the events of the night, grateful for the unexpected help. Eventually, our ride arrived, and we thanked the farmer, feeling an immense sense of gratitude for his timely arrival. We left his house, the shadows of the field still etched in our minds, but comforted by the thought that whatever was there, it's behind us now, and we've made it out safely. The evening had a sense of calm that felt earned after a long day of work. The sky had begun shifting to deep oranges and purples, casting a warm glow over the fields, and I was leaning back on the porch with a cup of coffee in hand, my daughter beside me. She had her own coffee, a habit she'd picked up from me. We sat there in silence, enjoying the way the light softened around us, the quiet hum of insects carrying on their endless song. This was our time, the peace we waited for at the end of each day. But that evening, something felt different. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just a flicker of unease, like a splinter pressing under the skin. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to tiredness, though my eyes kept drifting to the cornfield as the light faded. The fields went on for acres, the rows thick with tall stalks that whispered to each other when the wind blew through them. Yet tonight, the sound had a sharper edge, something that didn't quite belong. And then I heard it, a noise, faint but distinct, coming from the far side of the cornfield. It could have been the wind. It often played tricks, carrying sounds from other parts of the farm. Just the fields settling for the night, I told myself. But as the last of the daylight disappeared, a sound came again, louder this time, pulling me from my thoughts. I glanced at my daughter, about to make a comment, but my mouth went dry. Her coffee cup was on the porch rail, still full, and she was gone. My mind went blank as I tried to process what I was seeing. The coffee cup, her favorite one with the small chip on the rim, was balanced right there where she'd been sitting just moments before. My heart thundered in my chest as I called her name, a strangled sound that fell into the stillness without a reply. Panic set in, a force that drowned out all reason, and I moved without thinking, heading straight for the cornfield. As I pushed past the first row, I was engulfed in darkness. The stalks closed in around me, cutting off the view of the house behind. Each step was like wading into a nightmare, the rows of corn seeming to stretch on forever in the dim light. My ears strained for any sound, hoping for the reassuring voice of my daughter, anything to anchor me. But instead, I heard something else. A low, muffled cry, faint yet unmistakable, coming from somewhere deeper in the field. I called her name again, louder this time, but the only answer was the rustling of the corn, a cruel mockery of the silence that had fallen. Panic gripped tighter, and I moved faster, stumbling over roots and rocks, my breath coming hard and fast. I scanned the rows frantically, each shadow seeming to hold her face, each sound a possible clue. But as I went deeper, fear turned to dread. And then, ahead of me in the dim light, I saw him. My legs felt weak as I caught sight of the figure. A man, bent low, almost camouflaged among the stalks. My daughter was in his grip, her body limp, head lolling to the side, as he dragged her through the corn. The sight sent a rush of icy terror through me, freezing me in place for a second before I surged forward, reckless with fear and anger, his focus solely on hauling her unconscious form further away. My feet pounded against the soft earth, arms swinging wildly as I hurtled toward him. I could hear my own heartbeat, pounding in my ears, each beat screaming at me to run faster, to get to her before he disappeared into the night. The man glanced up just as I reached him, and in that brief moment I saw his face. Expressionless, like he was only carrying out some grim routine. I didn't hesitate. Throwing myself forward, I hit him with all the force I had, sending us both sprawling into the dirt. He let go of her and I scrambled up, positioning myself between him and my daughter. His face stayed blank as he rose slowly, brushing dirt off his shirt as if we were in some grotesque game. My fists clenched, a strange fury driving me as I lunged again, unwilling to let him take her another inch. Our bodies collided in a violent flurry of fists and limbs. I couldn't feel anything but raw desperation fueling my punches, each blow landing with a sickening force. The man's silence only fueled my rage. He didn't grunt or scream, just pushed back with a cold persistence that chilled me to the bone. Dirt kicked up around us. The world narrowed to this brutal struggle, me against him, with only my daughter's life on the line. He fought back with a strength I hadn't expected, his hands cold as they grappled with mine. For every blow I landed, he found a way to claw back, his eyes remaining empty and unfazed. The fear in me was sharp, mingling with a kind of primal resolve to protect her. I felt every scrape, every bruise, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. My fist kept swinging, my mind locked onto a single thought. I had to end this, had to make sure he couldn't harm her again. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, his body went slack beneath me. I sat back, chest heaving, hands trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline and terror. His figure lay still on the ground, an ominous reminder of the violence that had just erupted. But I had no time to dwell on it. I needed to get my daughter to safety. I scrambled to my feet, lifting her into my arms, feeling the weight of her life against me as I stumbled back toward the house. Her weight was heavier than I'd remembered, a reminder of the sheer vulnerability I'd just confronted. As I carried her, the silence of the cornfield seemed to press in on me, amplifying the soft rustle of corn and the echo of my own footsteps. I looked down at her, searching for any sign of life, and felt a rush of relief when her eyes flickered, hazy and unfocused. She wasn't fully awake, but her soft breath against my neck was enough to ease the terror gripping my chest. Step by agonizing step, I made my way back through the rows, each one feeling longer than it should. The house was just ahead, its silhouette a beacon in the night. Reaching the porch, I set her down gently on the steps, keeping my body close to hers, as if my presence alone could shield her from what had happened. The feeling of helplessness started to gnaw at me, a bitter reminder of how quickly peace could shatter. I fumbled for my phone, the weight of the silence only broken by the distant hum of insects, and called the police, barely managing to keep my voice steady as I reported what had happened. The minutes felt like hours as we waited. I kept glancing at the cornfield, half expecting to see that faceless figure lurking there, but there was nothing, only the tall, silent rows, as if they'd swallowed any trace of the horror that had just unfolded. When the officers finally pulled up, their flashing lights cut through the night, casting an eerie glow over the farm. I felt a strange mix of relief and apprehension as they approached, their faces grim and professional. One of them took my statement while the others fanned out, flashlights cutting through the darkness as they made their way to the spot in the cornfield where I'd fought the man. My words came out in fragments, still shaken by the violence of the encounter. I recounted the details as best I could. The sound of the scream, my daughter's sudden disappearance, the struggle with the stranger. They listened with a practiced calm, but I caught the flicker of doubt in their eyes as I described the attacker's blank face, his eerie silence. It all felt too unreal, even to me. The officers returned from the cornfield with a look that made my stomach sink. They hadn't found anything, no sign of the man, no evidence of a struggle. They led me back to the spot, their flashlights illuminating nothing but undisturbed rows of corn. The earth was soft, but there were no footprints, no broken stalks, nothing to prove what had happened. Just the rustling corn, indifferent to my horror. As the officers finished their questioning, frustration bubbled up inside me. I knew what I had seen, knew what I had felt, and yet their expressions held a quiet skepticism that left me feeling exposed and defenseless. When they left, I felt the weight of the silence settle in around us, more oppressive than before. My daughter was still disoriented, her memories scattered and confused, unable to fully recall what had happened. I checked the locks twice, 3 times, then again before finally sitting down, exhausted but too wired to sleep. I did all I could, and we're both safe now. The back road that cut through the farmland had always been my preferred route. Even late at night, there was a stillness to it that I'd come to find oddly comforting. The rows of corn that lined the road seemed almost protective, their tall stalks waving in the wind, casting shadows that danced under the moonlight. On most nights, I felt alone but safe. That changed the night I first saw them. It was just after midnight, and I was driving home after a long shift. The road stretched ahead, illuminated only by my headlights and the faint glow of the moon. Out of habit, my eyes scanned the edges of the cornfield, expecting the usual empty fields. But this time, something caught my eye, a faint shape lingering between the rows. I slowed down, squinting to make out its form. It looked like a figure, impossibly thin, standing still and staring out from the corn. I blinked, convinced I was just seeing things. But as I drew closer, the shape seemed to shift, retreating back into the darkness as my headlights swept over it. I told myself it was nothing, just a trick of the light or an animal moving between the rows. Yet as I drove on, a chill clung to my skin, an unease that wouldn't shake loose. When I finally reached home, I pushed the thought aside, convincing myself I was simply tired. But something lingered. The following nights only made things worse. I'd drive the same stretch, each time hoping to see nothing but the empty fields, the quiet corn rows. But in some night I saw them, sometimes just one, other times several. Figures standing between the rows, unnaturally thin and twisted at strange angles, just beyond the reach of my headlights. The shapes would vanish whenever I drew near, slipping back into the corn as if they'd never been there. Yet the feeling they left behind was real. My eyes locked onto the road as I passed by. There was something about them that didn't feel right. One evening, unable to take it any longer, I resolved to talk to someone about it, hoping a second opinion might quiet my nerves. There was only one person who knew the field like the back of his hand, the farmer who owned the land. I drove up to the farmhouse on a late afternoon, the cornfield visible in the distance, stretching endlessly in rows that seemed to vanish into the horizon. The farmer met me on the porch, his face creased with years of sun and labor, his handshake firm. We exchanged pleasantries, but I could feel my pulse quicken as I approached the reason for my visit. I recounted my late-night sightings, hesitant at first, but his eyes stayed fixed on me, listening with an unreadable expression. I told him about the tall, thin figures, how they'd always disappeared just as I got close, leaving nothing but shadows behind. I half expected him to laugh it off or dismiss it, but he simply nodded, folding his arms as he glanced toward the field. He assured me he'd check it out, suggested it might be animals or shadows playing tricks on me. But even as he spoke, there was a hint of unease in his voice, an undertone that suggested he wasn't entirely sure. I left feeling slightly reassured, yet my doubts gnawed at me. As I pulled back onto the road, I cast a final glance toward the cornfield, hoping to see nothing out of the ordinary. But the rows stood silent, as if hiding something I could never understand. The days passed uneventfully, and I found myself trying to brush off the strange sightings as just an overactive imagination. But then, rumors started circulating in town. A few locals mentioned seeing odd shapes in the fields at night, faint figures that seemed to vanish whenever anyone tried to get a closer look. I even overheard one driver at the gas station talking about seeing someone or something standing between the rows, watching as he drove by. Unable to shake the feeling that something more was going on, I drove back to the farmhouse one evening, hoping for answers. The farmer met me with a concerned expression, his eyes shadowed as he admitted that other people had reported the same sightings. He shrugged, saying he'd been out to the field several times since my visit, but hadn't found a thing. No footprints, no broken stalks, nothing that could explain what so many people claimed to have seen. A strange dread settled over me, a heavy, creeping feeling that seemed to deepen with each passing day. But no matter how often I passed by, I never found the courage to stop, to confront whatever lay hidden within those endless rows of corn. Every drive past the cornfield began to feel like a test of nerve. It wasn't just the occasional sight of those figures lurking between the rows anymore. It was the feeling that they were waiting. Their appearances became almost routine, but with each passing night, my unease grew, building with a kind of dreadful familiarity. The figures started appearing closer to the road, tall and crooked, their bodies at unnatural angles that seemed to defy human shape. The worst part was that they would vanish when I approached, but not with the haste of something trying to escape. Instead, they seemed to dissolve deliberately, a slow retreat back into the shadows, as though they knew I was watching. One night, as I drove by, the absence of the figures felt even worse. The cornfield lay still under the moonlight, no shadows, no movement. I felt a chill settle over me as I passed, a sense of foreboding that clung to me long after I'd left the field behind. It was as though the field was holding its breath, waiting for the right moment to reveal something I wasn't prepared to see. It was nearly 1 a.m. when I found myself driving the familiar stretch of road, the night darker than usual. The moon was hidden behind clouds, casting the fields into shadow. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my eyes flickering to the edge of the cornfield out of habit. I saw nothing, no shapes, no flickers of movement, only the silent rows standing in eerie stillness. I let out a shaky breath, relief mixing with a strange disappointment, as though the silence itself was mocking my fear. But then, as I turned my gaze back to the road, it appeared. Right in the middle of the lane, directly in front of me, a tall, dark figure, towering and motionless, staring straight at my car. My heart stopped, panic surging as I slammed on the brakes. The figure remained still, unaffected by the headlights illuminating its grotesque, elongated form. Instinct took over, and I swerved hard to avoid it. The car skidded off the road, tires screeching as I lost control. The world spun, a blur of darkness and flashing lights before everything came to a sudden, jarring stop. The last thing I saw before blacking out was the cornfield, silent and unyielding under the dim moonlight. I awoke to the sound of voices, faint and muffled, and the feeling of someone lifting me. Blinking against the harsh light, I saw paramedics surrounding me, their faces blurry and distant. I tried to sit up, to tell them what had happened, but my body felt heavy, uncooperative. The memories came rushing back. The figure on the road, the desperate swerve, the crash. I managed to speak, to tell them about the shadowy figure that had appeared in the road, but my voice sounded weak, disconnected from reality. The paramedics exchanged glances, the kind that spoke of practiced sympathy and skepticism. They assured me it was just a shock, likely a hallucination from the impact, something my mind had conjured in the heat of the moment. But I knew what I'd seen. As they loaded me into the ambulance, I caught a final glimpse of the cornfield, stretching out into the night. The rows stood silent, as if holding secrets they would never reveal. The feeling of dread settled over me, deeper than before, a reminder of what I'd seen, a figure that felt both real and impossible, something that should not exist, yet had waited for me on that lonely road. I spent 5 days in the hospital, the doctors monitoring me for any signs of concussion or other injuries. My body recovered quickly. When I was finally discharged, I returned home, feeling grateful to be alive, but a little uneasy.